Furman Hall, which is a celebration of arts and sciences in marine context and science context largely, but not exclusively. If you haven't had a chance to get down to Furman and see the arts and sciences interacting, please do this afternoon sometime. We're going until 8 o'clock this evening. We're also here as part of the Code Maker Fair tomorrow. So this event is, and this talk, are co-sponsored by the Spark event, the Code event tomorrow. So if any of you have an interest at all in handmaking, in any way, I assume you do, since you're here today, please come out for that and let me know about that tomorrow as well. We are very lucky and honored to have Bronwyn Bevan here today to speak to us about making and tinkering. We charged her very loosely with helping us think differently about how we teach and learn from a making lens and equity lens. I'm really glad I got Bronwyn here because I've known her for quite a while now, and she really represents, I think, three things that the Oregon State University, the College of Ed, Sea Grant, the Maker Fair Falls, really would like to see more of in the academy. And one of those is the connection between practice and research that honors practice, and practice that honors research. Bronwyn has stood in the middle of those two Venn diagram circles.
Smushed in the middle.
Yeah, for a while, and not as a bystander, but as an active leader in making those connections happen, and researching those connections, what it takes to make them happen, and in following through to make sure things come out of them. Bronwyn's also a kind of tireless spokesperson for equity and thinking about access and inclusion and equity in all parts of learning research, learning teaching practice, and in learning itself, learning events, whether it's on the museum floor or in the university classroom. So thank you for being here, and join me in welcoming Dr. Bronwyn Bevan. I'm going to turn it right over to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ron. Thanks, everybody. And, you know what I realized, just so as you were talking, like I probably should have gotten some water. Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, just because I've been I don't even know what time zone I'm in right now, so water can probably help me. Well, first of all, thank you very much, everybody, for showing up today. I know it's Bring Your Children to Work Day, so it's a busy day, I'm sure, for everybody, and I was just down at the Furman Hall and saw so many kids, and it was really great. And I don't know if people, I guess a lot of you probably just came from there, but there's this amazing Japanese artist who's carved birds, so I wore he didn't seem to notice my bird pants, but I was very excited by his work. I have this podium and this thing so I can read my notes, so I just apologize, my bullet notes. I apologize for coming back here every now and then. Thank you so much. What I wanted to do today, and we have you at tables because I'm really hoping to learn from you as much as I can share what the kinds of things we've been working on. So I'm hoping that there'll be a lot of table discussion and then talking as a group, but really to talk about making as an educative practice, and then what that means for equity. So just so I kind of understand who's in the room, I wanted to just do a quick poll to understand how many of you are designing or leading making type programs or activities now. Okay, so 5 or so. And then how about how many of you are researching or evaluating or studying in different ways making type programs now? So 1, about 7. And then how many of you are curious just about making, which is, okay, great, good to know. Yeah, I meant to say people should feel free to, raise their hands more than once. So, I don't even think you mentioned that I worked at the Exploratorium for 25 years. I'm finally getting to that point where I don't mention it all the time, but I just moved to the University of Washington about a little under 2 years ago, and I was at the Exploratorium for 25 years. So what I'm going to be talking about today really reflects the work I've done there. For the most part, I have been continuing since I moved to Seattle. But it's really the work I've developed in collaboration with the directors of the Tinkering Studio, who are Mike Petrich and Karen Wilkinson. So these ideas we've been pursuing together. I was just there yesterday talking to them about some of this work. Basically, the thing I want to lead off saying is that for us, and I think for a lot of people who are doing making, although I don't want to speak for everybody, and I'd say for the Exploratorium as a whole, what's the interesting thing about making and the work that actually preceded what became known as the maker movement in the mid-2000s is essentially the centrality of creativity in the learning process. So there's a real dedication to designing and leading learning opportunities, activities that really have creativity at the center. And of course, that's not just about making, right? So creativity at the center of math instruction, of history instructions, there's lots of different ways that can happen. But making is a really powerful way, we believe, of tapping into creativity. And really the purpose of doing that, I can't read my notes anyway, so I'm wearing one contact and not another, I'm gonna have to hold this thing, is that really the purpose is that, that through like creative processes of learning, you get deeper engagement, you get more motivated learners and deeper learning, and you also get the learner to really take ownership for their own learning because they're invested in it as their creative process. And in the end, that's kind of what we're most interested in, and I'll probably say that a lot. We're interested in learners owning their own learning process. So making is one way to do that. So these ideas aren't new, and I just want to acknowledge that, and I'm not going to go into this very much, but you probably, most of you recognize Vygotsky on the left and Freire on the right. As you know, Vygotsky really brought the whole idea of meaningful learning, motive-driven learning, goal-oriented learning as the driver of human learning and development. And Freire really brought to the picture the idea of agency and making change in the world. And actually one of my mentors is Anna Stutsenko, who's at the Graduate Center in New York. She actually has a new book out called Transformative Activist Stance or something like that. Her theory is the transformative activist stance, where she really brings together these two views of critical pedagogy and cultural historical theory. And in that frame, and this is kind of all I'm going to say about it today, is the idea that one of the criticisms of cultural historical theory is that you just repeat, like you're basically, it's kind of designed, the whole idea of coming into the fold is that you're actually just coming into existing practices and then just reproducing existing practices. So that's not a critique I subscribe to, but that's one of them. Bringing cultural or critical pedagogy to the discussion, Anna really makes the case that it is actually about sort of adopting cultural practices and tools in order to change oneself, to change the community that one's in, and to change the world. So it's really this idea of transformation at the heart of learning and development, those two being two sides of the same coin. And also that this is, in this process, it's that you are in the process of making yourself and making, the world around you as you're in the process of learning and engaging. And that's fundamentally identity work. So it's really seeing identity work at the heart of learning. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there as a salvo for saying like how I'm approaching making from this sort of creativity and also transformation and change approach. And when I say I mean we working on this together. And I just wondered if you could, just for a few minutes, and we started a little late, so I'm gonna have to give a little bit of short shrift to this, but if you could just talk to the person next to you, and it would be great if you could just talk to one person, two at the most, so that we don't spend too much time, so everybody has a chance to talk. About this question, what do you value about making, or what do you think you might be valuing about making if you're really just curious? And if you do have something that you really value strongly about it, what do you want other people to know about it? Like maybe it's something that you feel like is underappreciated in this idea of, and if you want to talk about creativity at the center of learning. So I just want to give you 1 minute to talk to your neighbor about that. I'd love to ask if anybody had something that they actually really want to say, or if they heard something that they'd like to share that surprised them or they thought was important. Yep.
So we came to this idea that it's something that connects people, but it's also essential to being human. That's why we have that thing here. And my grandmother makes me socks. And making is so essential and so infused in everything in our society that we do. So we think about those maker fairs right now in this context, but it's so essential and so everywhere.
It reminds us of our humanity.
Yes. And also that it's an essential component of being human.
Right.
Because without that, we wouldn't be able to.
Yep.
I think another idea that we brought up was the idea that a makerspace doesn't have to necessarily be about, or the idea of making can be the idea of making something else. That this sense in makerspace that you can kind of walk in and create, have fun for yourself, but a lot of times a lot of these makerspaces are really oriented towards providing a benefit to society or to others around the world that are really in need, and you're using your own creativity to drive an outcome.
Right. So it's that sense of really connecting in with people from all over the world who have some sort of shared.
Yeah, it's not just about your needs.
Right. Yeah, and there's a whole literature I was reading recently about sort of sustainability in makerspaces, and to the extent to which they're taking sustainability into account. One more, yeah.
Yeah, Rebecca brought up this sort of looking at making and thinking about making really foreground the performative aspect of learning.
Mm-hmm.
Right, this is learning with performance, which we often background in our research, that is the performance of self and of learning.
Right.
Just learning there for yourself.
So it's an active, creative process that takes the self, and you're committed to it. Yeah, I think that's right. So this is kind of the image of this is an image of a fab lab, so which is a stand-in for hacker spaces or other kinds of maker spaces, and it's kind of the image that has dominated certainly the marketing that has rolled the maker movement out. It's not necessarily what our work looks like, and probably a lot of people here, but it is definitely the dominant idea, and certainly the discussion coming out of the White House, the previous White House, and kind of all of the big sort of the Silicon Valley sector. It's a very tool-dominated environment. It's you get this notion of innovation and production and that sort of thing. And this has been the driver of the movement that started in the middle of I think it's 2005 was Make Magazine, and 2006 was Maker Faire, and now there are hundreds, like 300 plus, maybe 400 now, maker fairs, mini maker fairs around the country, and there's, I think there's 600 maker spaces that have been documented around the world. I meant the world for the other one too. And about 4 years ago, we did a lit review, and there were about a dozen peer-reviewed papers at that point. There's a ton of gray literature, and there's a ton of blogs that are all, very, very promotional of the movement, but there were about a dozen peer-reviewed papers, also pretty promotional, I would say. But now there's about 100, or at least, that I know of. And I recently published a new lit review, which had about 70 in it. And since then, I've read dozens more. And the research literature is starting to become more critical, which is kind of refreshing. And I think, and it's a big backlash actually, towards a completely uncritical backing of this movement for a long time. The way that we've thought about it is we've sort of parsed the maker movement into kind of 3 different buckets. One is it's kind of like this, and it's this notion of maker as entrepreneurism. And so certainly the White House, the Obama White House, pushed this in a big way because they really see this as a key to the future economy of the United States, that people are going to be and Gershenfeld, who started Fab Labs, this is his perspective too, give people the means of production. They can create their idea, they can produce it, and they can take it to market, whether it's through Etsy, and so they can make $40 a year, or whether it's through something else and they can actually make a living. That's a different issue. But those exist out in the world and in most communities, and oftentimes you have a membership fee or a use fee. The other kind of use that we saw, which is kind of like this, is kind of more of an engineering approach. And so those are programs that, and I think a lot of universities do them and sometimes make use of the spaces, but they're definitely kind of design build activities that really tie into engineering skills and typically have this notion of optimization. So you're trying to either win the competition or build the best thing or optimize in a way. And so it really does mirror engineering, but it's maybe a little bit more creative, it's hands-on, and it often makes use of these kinds of spaces. And then the third kind, which is educative making, which I'm going to be talking about today. And by the way, of course, like every list I'm going to give you today, it's completely not black and white, and really everything is, at least 1.5 of that list. So I want to say that there are no hard and fast rules, but in trying to think about it, educative making we think about is the kind of making that you put into a place that has been designed to educate people, and mostly in terms of what we're thinking about in terms of K-12. So some of that work is actually organized around entrepreneurism, as I said, let's say at a college level oftentimes, or engineering is either high school or college. But then at the elementary school, you tend to get into more inquiry, and that's into more sort of messy kinds of exploration. And there we've actually identified 3 different types. And those are assembly activities. So those are when kids a Lego kit is the classic, robotics or others. What we call creative construction, and I have kind of a couple of wrong computer, my notes and my image. Creative constructions are all of these kids made their own notebooks. This is their lab notes for their maker books, but they all look different. And there's a variety of different kinds of ways that they've closed them, latches, and they've also actually either sewn them or sometimes punch hole them or different kinds. So they brought something of themselves to creating their own thing, but the end point was a notebook. And then and here's another example of cardboard automata, which I'll talk about again in a second, where everybody was essentially getting a frame of a box and building with a cam and axle a rotational mechanism that would turn something at the top. What they put at the top varies, and that actually relates, and I'll get back to it later, to the actual dimensions of what they're building. But essentially, again, people know where they're going. It's just they can bring a little bit of themselves to that. So we call that creative construction. And then there's tinkering, what we call tinkering. And that's where there really is no blueprint. It's really the notion of here's an idea, here are some materials, oftentimes very carefully curated. But now it's a process of exploration. And I want to say that all of those methods are useful. So it's really helpful to do Legos or to do things that even step by step, it's really, if you're learning to cook, it's really helpful sometimes to have a recipe. Even if you're a really seasoned cook and just to learn a new technique, to learn a new tool, to learn a new idea or ingredient. So we definitely see the value of going back and forth with all of these, but with the ultimate goal, I would say, of this way of working that doesn't really have a blueprint. So the problem, or the challenge, I guess, of this is that this kind of work, this sort of more tinkering-oriented, more open-ended work, by its very nature is organic, and it's very contingent. It depends on a whole lot of things that go on, including what's maybe going on next to you and what you see in other people's work. And when it really works well, it's very surprising. It surprises the learners, and it can surprise the adults, the teachers. So it kind of works in the opposite direction for how schooling and a lot of other forms of education have been designed to, where actually you're supposed to know where you're going to get, and you're supposed to be able to monitor the way of getting there. And oftentimes that's chunked into discrete, times, as you know, like we're supposed to get to here by today or here by next week or whatever it is. So by its very nature, there's this fundamental challenge in tinkering about, in fact, being able to show people what's going on because it's such a messy process. This is kind of what drove us, and I'm going to ask you to talk again in a minute. This is kind of what drove us at the Tinkering Studio, which is we're really deeply committed to this creative, open-ended, messy, organic process. For those people who kind of either get it or have done it and experienced it, people are right there. But for those who are either curious or skeptical, it's very hard to see what's going on. So that kind of launched us into this really it's been over 10 years now, this process of a series of studies, I'll talk about one of them, that we've been working on to try to capture the learning, document the learning, articulate the learning without stopping the learning. And certainly in the context of the museum, without stopping the entire experience of the museum visit. But we've been working over the last few years in a lot of after school. So that was sort of the start of all of this. And so I just wanted to say that that was our concern about making. Like, we believe in it, but how can we talk about it? So I just wondered if you could take 2 minutes again at your tables and just talk about what worries you about, or what is your what makes you skeptical, or what do you wonder about, or what do you worry about in terms of making? 2 minutes. So maybe we can share with each other across the tables. Maybe what are some of the concerns or worries or questions that came up in the group? Yep.
Well, we initially talked about the word making, and what comes to mind first, if you think about the negative side of things, the making of things, and how many things do we need to make or necessary to make, and that baseline between the making as a tool for learning and the products that come out of it, whether or not necessary or not, so that fine line about making more stuff.
Yes. Yeah, so that's back to the sustainability, consumerism, productionism idea, and also trying to do an abstract search with the word making to see that is, it means a lot of things. Other concerns that came up?
I'll borrow a comment. It started with Martin, the bifurcation of play versus instruction, and that being almost like polar opposites, that you have to work and bring them back together in some way. How did that happen?
So the fact that play left the instructional context, and now we have to create a whole movement in order to, yeah. And I think that's a big part of the driver for a lot of the reason people are. I don't think it's a coincidence that this all happened towards the end of No Child Left Behind, for example. Other thoughts?
The flip side from one another is like the trivialization of the making now, that there's a risk that people embrace it and claim it when they're not.
Right.
And the other way is the holier than thou. You were commenting on the idea that there are many different ways to make it, for making, and they are all valuable in certain ways.
Right.
But then there might be now a risk that people are saying, you're doing it wrong.
Right.
Because I claim neither on what making is. So, but there are like flip sides of one another.
Yeah.
The definitional power of people claiming that space now because it's safe.
Yeah, that's right.
What that will do to
We actually struggled with that ourselves, and we ended up going, down this path of trying to be definitional a little bit, partly because it just felt like you wanted to be able to say, well, this is when you want to do Legos, and this is when you don't, versus saying like, don't do Legos. Or like Legos is the end all and be all, which it is for some kids, obviously, but you know what I mean. So, all right, well, let me talk a little bit about, just shift a little bit into how we've been thinking about issues of equity. So first of all, we do feel that there is this liberatory power in making, again, because creativity is at the center of it. And again, I'm not diminishing in any way the other kinds of creative learning that happen in other kinds of settings. But what we really have been focused on is to think about it beyond the notion of access. So of course, a lot of times conversations about equity really kind of end at this notion of access and participation. And so for us, the issue is sort of what is really meaningful about what's going on, and how for learners, and how can we provide making programs that can make making meaningful for learners, all learners, and different learners. So one quick note is that the maker spaces, by the way, have been in the literature, they've been called like counter contexts, which is a phrase from Pfaffenberger from the 70s or the 80s, I think. But currently in the literature, I just share this with you, that whole idea is being contested, and there's a woman named Rebecca Willett who did an analysis of libraries, and she basically said, at the same time We talk about maker spaces as affinity spaces, which is a Jim G term. So places where people who have affinities come together, but we also say in the same moment that they're open to all. And like, how can they really be both? And that seems to be a really big tension. There's also a feminist critique led by Fox and many other people, which really questions like whose making is visible. And if you think back to that initial Fab Learn type image that I had, you know, that was, you know, I think very closely allied with images, sort of masculine space, Silicon Valley space, sort of structures of power kind of space. And so there's a big critique in many papers being written on that subject right now. But this is I wanted to just share, and then I'm going to actually ask you to think about it. I don't know if you had a chance to look at any of the programs that were happening today. This is actually coming from a woman named Emily Dawson, who's based at University College in London. She's got a paper coming out very shortly, and I think she's written about it before, but she talks about equity in terms of social justice you know, movements, and she thinks specifically about relational social justice and redistributive social justice. So the redistributive social justice idea is access and participation. Like, are we getting ideas out there or opportunities out there, and are we in fact welcoming people in so that they can participate in them? And her point is that that actually is really not enough, and that in fact, I mean, she says it's sort of like it takes this crusade mentality. Like, you know, we have this thing, you know, the Crusades, it was Catholicism, now it's making. You know, it's really great, and you should be doing it, and we're going to bring it to you, and you can like join us. And you know, Oki Lee and Cory Buxton have called that an assimilationist model of equity, right? So that's one thing. Now, important to say, you need to have opportunities to be able to, you know, appropriate them and transform them. So it's not, again, that that's not the way to go, but that it's not enough. And so then she talks about relational social justice, which is really about thinking about the relationship between the experience and the individuals that are participating in it. So it calls into question definitions, power, histories, and it sort of requires you to perhaps rethink what making looks like. So I'm not actually, I hadn't planned to go back to this, and I'm not really touting this in comparison to the Fab Lab, but this is a making space. It sends a lot of different kinds of messages. It looks like a kid's space and a crafting space, whereas that other space didn't. So I just want to read one thing that she wrote about relational recognizing difference, and then I'm going to ask you another question, which is, she basically says, relational social justice requires us to recognize, respect, and value that people differ and take those differences into account rather than treating everybody as the same. I'm totally paraphrasing because I can't read, but that's basically what she says. And that this approach requires a commitment to exploring beyond issues of access and participation, which she calls weak inclusion. So, you know, this redistributive, this sort of high up, this is where she would say you have very strong inclusion, high access and participation, and high relational. I wrote responsiveness in terms of thinking about, and then this is of course low. But she's basically created this tool in words, I turned it into this, for people to think about their programs. Like, where are they on the redistributive versus relational axes? So this approach requires a commitment to exploring beyond issues of access and participation, which is weak inclusion, to include questions of knowledge, representation, power, and cultural change, which is strong inclusion. So I am going to ask you, and then I'm going to cut my talk really short, to think about not this, oh, wrong thing, not how you see equity in making, although you can have that, you can answer that, you can talk about that if you want, but actually to think about if you saw anything this morning. So I'm going to throw these two questions. If you were at the fair, or not the fair, but the activities down there today, if you can think about what you saw or noticed this morning, and think about what might have shifted that activity a little bit towards more relational social justice. And so I'll go back to this to say equity in making, but if you saw anything today, I think it would be great to think about what you saw and how might it have been designed. I noticed a lot of activities, it might have just been the moment I was there, by the way, because I know how these things ebb and flow. A lot of boys at certain things, and you know, there's a lot of, you know, and in some it was more mixed. But, and it's no judgment, I just think that's the kind of thing that one might have noticed and thought, how might it have been different? So I'm going to go back to this just to, because it's so informative. I'll leave that there for you to look at. But can you talk about that for a couple of minutes? Could people, I think that was a tough question because because, you know, you haven't just spent the whole day at the Maker Faire. And I certainly, when you know, thinking about that axis, I think it really helps to inquire into your own practice, and maybe it's harder to think about observing other people's. So I don't know if anybody has anything that they want to share in terms of how they, like even just thinking about relational versus redistributive, if that's useful in terms of thinking about something like making, which is so much, as I said, it is sort of a crusade in a lot of ways, the way it's been perpetrated. Nobody's believed.
I think it was very easy for me in terms of our thinking here to operationalize what access looks like. What would be high level access and how would I see that? And it was relatively more difficult to operationalize relational social justice.
Right.
What would high sort of responsiveness look like?
Right.
Versus low responsiveness.
Right.
So that was, in fact, I had to leave the making exhibit, the making activity, and think about what we've been trying to do with exhibits and the kind of co-creation of research and exhibits with visitors.
Right.
And think about that.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things we've been doing in our research in after-school programs in rural and urban California is really looking at how the activities build on the home practices of kids, so they may not be the same, but that they employ skills or sometimes tools or materials that kids know are you know, happen in their families or communities, so that it doesn't create this line in between, like, well, you people do this and we people do that. So that's one, like, I'm just sharing some, you know, concrete ways that, and also working in multiple languages and different, you know, there are other kinds of ways to think about things. But I think it's largely the design of what counts as making, and can people see themselves in it, and see the people that they care about, and the people they are actually on the way to becoming on some level, you know, as if nothing else, as family members in that activity. I'm going to really, I'm going to jump ahead, I think, in a lot of ways. We've been, as I said, we've been studying. We've had a series of studies over 10 years and plus, and we moved from working sort of nationally with people. So they've all been research practice partnerships. I don't really have time to describe what that is, but equal voice at the table. Sean kind of made a point about this earlier. People looking at data together to try and articulate and refine what they see and what they value and care about, and that ultimately gets turned into codes, which are applied to the, you know, video data a lot of times. And we spent a long time recently working with this network of after-school programs I mentioned, and right now we're in a school. And we're in a school in Oakland where we're looking at making an after-school, but looking at how that learning flows into the school day. And this gets back to what I was saying at the beginning, where we're trying to come up with a way of speaking about it and understanding that resonates with people beyond those who are already into it and wanting to do it. So, so I am just going to skip ahead. I do want to share this one just image, which is, this is sort of at a workshop where it's called a marble machine, because I'm going to be showing a bunch of images from it. And in this case, so has anybody not ever seen this activity before? Okay, so basically pegboard, a lot of different kinds of interesting materials in the middle. There's a slinky here, funnel, there's a fork, there's you know, copper pipe, that looks like a vacuum tube, like a vacuum cleaner tube, and cardboard and foam and tape and things to, whatever those things are called, those things, plastic things to tie things together. So in this case, in a workshop, people were assigned in teams to, basically the prompt was, see how slowly you can get the marble to roll, to end. So they're trying to, in theory, they're trying to get this to move very slowly. As it happened, they saw the slinky first, and they wanted the slinky. And so the slinky ended up like basically creating this drive, which is actually about like how creativity and self-expression are so integrated into this work. So then they tried to slow it down here because the funnel really slows down a marble. They also played with this length because it made different sounds. It was really kind of interesting. Just the whoosh of the marble made different sounds depending on the coil. And at any rate, now this is the kids at the school doing the same thing. These kids saw the staircase as part of their materials, and they started to go up and out, and created this massive marble machine, which then created like there was a lot of velocity on that marble as it came down, so it created all kinds of different channels, and that again is like the interplay of interesting materials, a staircase, and the goal and basically how the actual inquiry becomes more and more complex as a result. So we have this is a draft because it really is a draft, but this is our current, it's as you see yesterday, 2017, it was sort of like, this is one from yesterday, but the prior version also said that, and that was from a couple weeks ago. Basically, we had an earlier version, it was actually published in Science Education, that looked something like this, but not quite. It was based on a video data set taken at the museum, and it was fundamentally limited in some ways because it didn't really call out the creativity and the critical thinking problem solving that we saw all of the time. So we spent now 3 semesters in this school, like following kids over long periods of time. We have tons of data, and have begun, and again through talking with the teachers and what they value and what they're seeing, have ended up in this space. So initiative and intentionality, problem solving, critical thinking, conceptual understanding, creativity, self-expression, social and emotional engagement. We're still arguing about a lot of this. This has been belonging, this has been social scaffolding, this has been solidarity. We kind of landed here partly because we want this to speak to school people. And that's a term that, as you know, with SEL, has some meaning. So does belonging, but belonging doesn't have as much meaning to making people. So this is where we are. So the one thing I want to say is, like, the fact that these can apply to almost anything is actually the point. Like, we're trying to say, like, these are things that actually, aren't we all kind of working towards helping kids develop as part of their learning? But what we're doing over here, which you can't read, I realize that, is trying to identify indicators in making that are really not only very specific to making, but and tinkering, but also demonstrate the ways in which making and tinkering are maybe really well suited to develop some of these outcomes. So, for example, moving from trial and error to more focused inquiries and strategies based on the feedback from the process of building. That is, of course, it's a process of becoming a more critical thinker to understand, to make your experiments and your trials and your test runs more and more kind of efficient or elegant, because you're learning what not to do. It's something that we want kids to be able to do in general. Making is really good for that because the feedback is immediate and people are invested in the thing working, and so when they get feedback, they make adjustments and they begin to push aside the things that don't seem to be mattering, and they move along. Another one, for example, is for conceptual understanding, leveraging the physical properties of the material and phenomena to achieve design goals. So that earlier one I mentioned, I said I'd get back to it, the cardboard automata. The interesting thing about that activity is that you can design whatever you want to at the top, and if you may remember that there were, or you may not, there were some dancing dogs, there was actually, I don't remember. That was one of them. There were dogs, and there were three totally different kinds of things at the top. But depending on how you design the cam and the axle, if you do a round one, it'll move in certain ways, and if you make it an oblong, it will move differently. So what we find with this activity, for example, is that some kids have an idea about what they want to create and the movement that they want, and that drives them to really figure out the exact dimensions of the cam and the axle to make it move in the way they want to move. That's a constraint. It's an aesthetic constraint that drives their learning. Sometimes it works in the opposite way, where people build the cam and axle and then the movement is determined by what they've built, and now they have to really think about creatively what are they going to design that goes on the top that is going to move either up and down or spinning around or that sort of thing. So I mean, I won't read them all, but that's sort of the big idea of finding ways that we can, and we'll continue to work on it, just get more and more specific about how these things play out in making. And I'm just going to kind of end by just showing you some of the examples of the way we've been documenting in a workshop, which is, so this is from this is an adult workshop for makers that happened just a couple of weeks ago. And I've got a few pictures, I'll just jump through a couple of them. We actually, Karen Wilkinson, who's one of the directors of the Tinkering Studio, and I went through, this was a 90-minute activity. We took a lot of photos and we listened in and we observed. And so we prepared this the next day to share with the participants themselves. And we just put quotes. We have ethnographic field notes, so we have whole descriptions, but this is just quotes. So to share with them how we were both, the kinds of learning that they, to begin to articulate for them words towards their experience. So when we heard these two, Paul and Yvonne, they were compelled to use this machine, which you can see these little nails, and a marble goes through and it will go out one of these 3 holes at the bottom. And Paul really loves pachinko machines, it turns out. So he saw this as like a pachinko machine. So that became the central driving force of everything that was to follow. And then Yvonne says, yeah, and this one, which was the one that the marble was least likely to go through, was going to be the express lane. So they actually made 3 different avenues. And this was just an off-the-cuff remark, but it told us that they actually were thinking here. They had a goal now. They had a fast, medium, and slow track that they were developing. For problem solving and critical thinking, these two, Owen and Chengguang, did a very tightly constrained, perfectly working marble machine. But they got it done, and then they were able to spend a lot of time fine-tuning things and dampening the bouncing, in particular, as the marble moved, so that they could control it more. So this was, in this case, they said that when they presented. Sometimes these things are overheard, and sometimes not. I want to say that sharing these things with people in the room, a lot of the teachers have started to talk about doing the same thing with their kids. It just really helps make it concrete, because they just lived it, and they're celebrating it. This is a really interesting one. They wanted this idea of a pulley where the marble would come down and the weight of it would come down here and tip it and drop it over, and then it would continue on its way. They got it to work perfectly. They did so much problem solving and critical thinking, and an hour later, I saw it work a dozen times. An hour later, it stopped working for them, and they ended up deciding, I think this is in a conceptual understanding slide, that actually the cup had gradually weakened during the course of all of the different trials that they had done. They knew it that much, they had tested it that carefully, that they were really able to rule out all of the other possibilities. So here are some quotes where, in this case, they've really isolated the place where the problem is happening, and you can see they're trying to get it to ring this cowbell and then go on, and they sort of figured out exactly how to slow down the marble at the end. So they've really controlled for variables in their tests. This is the one where she realized the cup is the problem. Couple more. This is one I mentioned who the slinky just drove the entire thing. And then actually the slinky was done, and then this person felt that it was too easy. So she actually started to create this entirely different thing on the side to try and get it to go differently. So I'm not going to show you any more of these, but we have, I just wanted to share it as a way to document the learning. And we're doing it for all of them. And this is just super slow right now. Sorry, this is, okay. Very last thing. What we've been doing, I just can't put that down, in terms of thinking about the design. So I guess the last thing I want to leave you with is that what's really clear is that this doesn't happen by accident. Like, unlike actually a lot of what the early maker literature said, which was just put it out there and they can do it, it actually takes a lot of careful it's a pedagogy. It takes real effort and attention. And we've been looking at the environment in which it happens, the design of the activities, and the facilitation of the activities, and spending a lot of time over the years documenting that. Just to give you this is a high level one, like we've really looked at the ways in which designing makerspaces so that you have this residue of prior work there to seed ideas, so you have this sort of open horizon so people can, so the sharing of ideas is like is the key element of a making space. So whether it's sharing, like, I know how to do this, I can teach you, or whether it's like, that's a great solution, I want to use it, or like, what an idea, I want to try it. So these open horizons and putting the materials in the center of the room, so if people get ideas and they want to go get something, they have to pass by other people's work in order to like get their thing, and they get ideas in that process. So we've been looking at those kinds of things, proximities. And then on the activities, again here, and this is, I think, partly about being responsive. How can you make, first of all, the materials be so interesting that kids just are compelled to pick them up, and once they're holding something, they're going to start to do something with it. How can you design activities so that there's not one way to start, you know, and I'm talking about the blueprint, no blueprint activities, but there's multiple ways into it, and there's multiple ways, things that people can do. There's so many ways into the marble machine, and in that collection, I didn't show you all of them, you know, we had maybe 12 different machines, and they were all, there was not one that was like another. They were all completely different. We are really careful, I haven't even talked about STEM learning so much, but we're really careful to position STEM as like not the purpose, but just the tools and the means. And that finally, that through iterative work, that everything can be made more complicated. And that's just so critical. If there's an ending point, then some kids get there right away, and some kids never get there, and it can be frustrating for both kids. So things can be continually complexified, and and kids can always go further with the activities. And some of the facilitation strategies that we've documented are this notion of starting off with a demonstration, but only a half-finished object. So we've discovered that if you actually show the full thing, people are going to want to copy it or feel like they can't do it. This notion of constructing, and then we call it creating like a what-if culture. So really asking kids when they're stuck, which happens a lot. It's one of the really critical things, which is why pedagogy is so important in making, is kids get stuck and they can get frustrated, and you have to work with them. And that's why it's more intensive. Obviously, most creative learning and teaching is more intensive than, you know, a transmission model. But asking kids to explain what they were doing, what they were trying, helps them oftentimes really just unpack what's going on, and helps them get unstuck. So these are kind of the ideas for the work. So I realize it's after 2. I was going to ask you to think about this, but I think I won't because of the time. This is sort of, I just kind of slammed it all into one table, all of the different dimensions that we've been documenting. I guess I want to leave you with, I hope I'm leaving you with, let me move back to that other photo because it's prettier, with this idea that like we've been taking it really seriously over the last decade, like that we see it as, it's not the end all and be all, but that it's a really important lever and opportunity for kids to, especially kids, to experience learning in new ways. We've seen in schools, we've seen teachers use making activities to introduce a topic and just get kids immersed in sort of developing some intuitive senses of the phenomena or materials. We've also seen them do it in the middle as transition points, and we've seen them use them at the end as assessments, so like kids can really demonstrate their knowledge. So we've seen all of that. But what we feel like we've pretty well documented is just that it really does take this kind of attention to making sure that there's this open and supported environment for, and it's both the activities and the way that the facilitation happens for sure, and thinking also about the environment. So I want to leave it at that, given the time. So thanks a lot, and I hope, I'd be welcome, to chat more or whatever. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, sure.
We do have still some time in the room for questions at this point.
Or I could just.
A lot of us will also be going back to the events at Furman Hall, and Bronwyn will be there as well. So you could join us there if you like for.
Yeah, I get to.
Can you go back to your other slide where you had the whole?
Yeah.
And where is that?
I know. It's in Italy. It's in Milan. It's actually at the Science Museum in Milan. I know. Isn't that amazing?
I've been in Russian palaces that look like.
Yeah, I know.
That's cool.
Yeah.
I guess the question I was having, I study how adults learn in complex tasks,
Mhm.
trying to facilitate learning with lots of people and lots of ideas. And so I was looking at your facilitation list and wondering why those and why not others? I mean, do you feel like that's a complete set or?
It's certainly not a complete set for how to facilitate. No, I think what we tried to draw out here are the kinds of facilitation moves that seem critical to instruction that was iterative and materials based. And these are these ideas or these constructs came through this sort of research practice process that I briefly mentioned, where practitioners were talking about what they felt was most important. Which led the coding, and then, sometimes, as I said, we saw other things. But I mean, what kinds of things would you think should also be there?
Well, I just saw them as very similar to the things that we talk about,
Uh-huh.
and the things that we work on, and so that's why I thought it was an interesting list, and thinking about how that environment, the designed environment and the facilitation play with each other, and how different design environments might actually attend to similar facilitation moves. And then I was wondering, well, what designs in the environment would call for different facilitation moves? And I was trying to play across those two different spaces.
Right, yeah, because you could do making in any environment, but it's true. Like the notion, I think it's much harder to do it in a space that is not your own, not a dedicated space. I mean, it's possible, but you then have to create this like pedagogical context as opposed to a physical context, so that you don't have the residue or the ideas that are there. So yeah, there may be a bigger burden on the facilitator to get kids to articulate their ideas and get going. Yeah, but I'd be interested to see the kinds of ideas that you've been working with in terms of adults and complex activities. Yeah.
One of my curiosities is, personally, I've come to making as a thing, not as someone as an educator, but certainly not as a scholar of education.
Mm-hmm.
So somewhat shallow in that regard, but I've come to it as a means for community engagement of one sort or another, which I think is incredibly effective. And I'm just wondering, in your own experience within your scholarship, how much the dynamic of making, whether it's time to place or not, is it informed by your approach or echoes your approach or similarities or other pathways that you haven't addressed here today that might be worth consideration as well?
So, and when you say community making, you mean kind of like in maker faire type things, sort of whole families coming together?
Potentially, it's a very broad term, but I think creative placemaking might be one way to
Uh-huh.
label it, or intergenerational community building.
Yeah.
Co-created projects between a center and community group. Making seems to be not only glue
Yeah.
to connect, but also ammunition to create something.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things, the Tinkering Studio group, especially earlier on, actually none of them had kids themselves, and so they used to get so mad at the parents because the parent, they would see like the parents were like getting in the way and like taking over the tools and like, and I'd be like, well, that's kind of, that's like parents called scaffolding. Your child's learning, like it's not, like there's that something in between. So I think that. But I do see that as one of the tensions of, intergenerational work that I don't know that we've all figured out. Maybe you have, but how do you give everybody a really meaningful role where people are actually owning what they're doing? And sometimes you do see people getting so excited and working on something together, parent and child, and running with that. But for the most part, our work has really been in designed educational settings and not out in the community. So I don't really have, I think a lot to contribute about that. I don't know if that was an all answer.
It's all incredibly helpful.
Yeah.
Depth is growing by millimeters at a time.
Right.
But it does make me eager to think even of a lit review, how much, for example, the 70 sources have brushed up against that type of endeavor.
Right.
Or is that somewhat of an unexplored field?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've just been reading about like the feminist critique there's just a whole lot of women's makerspaces and hackerspaces that are opening up, but they're not really getting at the community intergenerational stuff. They're much more focused on creating spaces for women, for example. And then there's the Fab Lab. So yeah, I just don't know that there's a whole lot yet on that. Other than the Maker Faire notion, which is the community science workshops in California, those are spaces where parents can come in and make things, but the focus is on the kids, I would say, so it's just different.
Other questions, comments at this point?